Okay, I think we are ready to get started. So hi, everybody. My name is Jenny Culbertson. I'm the director of the Center for Language Evolution here at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to this last talk in the Edinburgh Lectures in Language Evolution series for this year. So you've all come to see Asifa Majid, and we'll start her talk shortly, but just a couple of things to note beforehand. So first, it's been a really fabulous series. It's been great to hear all these wonderful talks, and I want to thank our other speakers, Ev Fedorenko, Griffiths, and Tecumseh Fitch for their talks, and everybody for their interesting questions as panelists. If you missed any of the talks, please do check them out on YouTube. I also want to thank again our student organizers. So that's Elizabeth Pankratz, Ashton Keogh, and Henry Conklin. This really couldn't have happened without you all, so thanks very much. I also just want to mention that if you're a student and you're watching this and you're interested in coming here to do MSc with us or a PhD with us, please do get in touch. We're definitely taking students and we'd love to have you. I think that's it. So those of us who are here are going to be enjoying a reception after, sponsored by the UKRI, NLP, CDT, and NLP. So thanks to them for sponsoring that. Without further ado, I'm going to invite Henry up here to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Jenny. It's my pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Professor Asifa Majid. Asifa is a professor of cognitive science at St. Hugh's College, Oxford. Her work tries to disentangle which aspects of cognition are fundamentally shared and which are language or culture specific. This work picks apart the complex relationship between language, culture, and cognition through experiments with people from diverse backgrounds and cultures. She has pioneered ways of formally assessing and understanding aspects of human culture that are so often ignored in favor of traditional approaches that focus on understanding language and language alone. Looking at a broad range of our perceptual abilities from smell and taste to vision and touch, her work on human cognition, more than almost anyone else's, tries to appreciate the richness of human culture and what it means to be human, focusing in on the ways in which we are diverse rather than treating everyone other than native speakers of English as an outlier. We're so excited for her talk here today and for her to finish out our series. And with that, over to you, Asifa.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thanks to the organizers for a great series of talks. So let me just, as I was preparing for my talk, I thought it was useful for myself at least to just remember some of the highlights from the past panelists. So we heard from Tecumseh that language is a system that allows us to encode and communicate any of our thoughts and experiences into signals. Ev suggested that language is not needed for complex thought, but its roots might lie in communication instead. And Tom suggested that language might be a tool for overcoming the limitations of our inductive biases. So to this today, I'm going to add another perspective on language in that it provides us intersubjective sensory experience. So from my perspective, I'd argue that language plays a fundamental intermediary role between the subjective individual nature of perception and the cultural world. That thoughts and experiences are not equally expressible in language. The way a language cuts up the sensorium has repercussions back onto perception and cognition, and that language plays a crucial role in constructing the very landscape of our consciousness. So this is that already provides you what I'm going to show you, hopefully. But before going into the empirical data, I thought it would be useful just to provide some more background on how I'm thinking about the relationship between language and thought. And of course, for this audience who's particularly interested in the evolution of language, we can, of course, wonder about what the cognitive precursors or cognitive consequences would be for us modern humans as a consequences of our ancestors acquiring language. We can also think about what cognition is like in pre-linguistic infants who have yet to acquire full language, to the adults who have full capacity to deal with all sorts of language. And then what happens to cognition, say later in life, if you are unfortunate enough to suffer from aphasia and not be able to produce or comprehend language in the same way anymore. Now here, I think it's important just to remind ourselves that the cognition of a pre-linguistic infant is different to that of a non-human primate, say, because the pre-linguistic infant has a language-ready brain. And now what happens in cognition in the adult when language is not being utilized is quite different to what we would see in a non-linguistic organism, because for human adults, they already have constructed their concepts as a result of their language input too. So these are just some backgrounds to keep in mind as we look at the data later. I think it's also useful just to distinguish language with a capital L, which is, I think, been the brunt of a lot of our conversation so far. So this is language as a general human capacity. And today I'm going to focus more on language with a small l, and that's looking at particular vernaculars, if you will. And so for me, it's really important to consider the cross-linguistic and cross-cultural diversity that there is. What can we learn about language, capital L, on the basis of studying specific languages that we find worldwide? So today I'm going to try and elucidate some of what we might learn from using this cross-linguistic diversity to our advantage to understanding cognition itself. So in my own thinking about this, I was particularly inspired by the early work of these two gentlemen, Eric Lenneberg and Roger Brown, who did some pioneer work on thinking about the relationship between language and cognition with a domain that most people will be familiar with today, which is color. So in an early study from the 1950s, Roger Brown and Eric Lenneberg suggested that perhaps colors that were more codable in language, and by more codable, they meant if you give individual speakers these color chips to name, those colors that have short names, so short in syllables and short in the number of words, that had agreement across individuals and agreement within an individual over time. So if you had to name the same color twice, you gave it the same name, and that whose labels came to mind quickly, that these color chips were more codable, and that might affect the way that we remember those colors. And indeed, when they collected naming data and then separately memory data, they found that there was a correlation between the two. So in this table, you can see that codability, the ability to name colors, correlates with the recognition of colors, taking into account the discriminability of the colors themselves. So from this, they conclude that language is not a cloak following the contours of thought. Rather, languages are molds into which infant minds are poured. Now, of course, you've probably already recognized that from this single study of English speakers showing a correlation between naming abilities and memory doesn't tell us which direction that effect goes. And of course, they recognize this too, and which led to Lenneberg and Roberts sketching out this very nice paradigm, which has been used again and again in the literature, that if we understand the psychophysical perceptual space, and we find that languages differ in how they carve up that space, we can use those cross-linguistic differences to ask whether the underlying cognition for that color space might be different. And in their paper in 1956, Lenneberg and Roberts had some preliminary evidence that perhaps Zuni speakers and English speakers remembered colors differently from each other, but in line with their own language categories. Now, this was taken to be exciting evidence in favor of the Whorfian hypothesis that language affects thought, until Eleanor Roche's work in the 1970s. Eleanor Roche looked at Dani color memory and compared it to American English speakers. And based on a study of memory for the two communities, concluded that memory was the same, even though the Dani and the Americans differed in how they talked about color. Now, that was the zeitgeist then for a couple of decades. until Debbie Robertson's work in 1999. Davidoff and colleagues published in Nature showing that if you take into consideration some of the methodological limitations of the earlier Haida work, then in fact languages seem to remember colors in line with the way that the linguistic encoding in their community goes. And more importantly, perhaps, was Debbie Robertson's paper a year later, which showed that memory did indeed differ between communities in line with linguistic encoding, but it seemed to rely on verbal encoding on the fly. So if you gave people a verbal interference task at the same time as they were encoding colors, then the category-specific advantages seemed to disappear. Since then, there have been dozens of studies using different paradigms looking at color perception in different labs, all finding that perception seems to go along with linguistic encoding in languages. And I think this study is...
Lost Asifa for a moment. Oh, yeah. You cut out for a minute, Asifa, so maybe go back to the previous slide.
Okay. So just to say that since that earlier work, there have been dozens of studies from different labs showing that color perception seems to be in line with color coding in language. So one study that demonstrated this very nicely is by Martin Meyer and Rasha Abdel-Rahman, who used the attentional blink paradigm to investigate whether different ways of coding color might affect the ease with which it comes into consciousness. So they use the attentional blink paradigm. Essentially in an attentional blink, if you have to identify two visual stimuli that come in.
Asifa, we lost you again there.
It's just audio. The video is working.
It's coming in fine for me, so I think it may be a problem at your end.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, in that case, continue on and we'll work on it here.
Okay, sorry about this. Meyer and Abdel-Rahman used the attentional blink. So if you have to identify two visual stimuli in quick succession, then your accuracy in identifying the second stimulus is poor if it comes too soon after the first stimulus. So they decided to use this to look at a difference in linguistic coding for dark and light blue between Greek and Russian, which distinguish these two lexically, and German, which like English has a single term for the two. So they had a visual detection task where you have a number of stimuli coming in quick succession. And what participants have to do is actually pay attention to the shapes. So they have to say whether a semicircle is oriented up or down, or whether a triangle is left or right. But on some critical trials, the stimuli differ in their colors. So they want to know whether if the colors are from different categories, that makes it more liable to pop into consciousness earlier. So they compare blue with green, where all of the languages show the same linguistic encoding, and then mixed color categories. And what they find is that for the Germans, as you would predict, that there is the colors, when they're mixed colors, so blue and green appearing, pop into consciousness more than if they're from the same color category. And for Russian and Greek, the lexical distinction between light blue and dark blue also makes those colors appear into consciousness more than when they're from the same color category. So they conclude that our native language and the color categories we apply within it can influence whether we consciously perceive a stimulus or not. And that seems to be in line with the Brown and Lenneberg claim that more nameable categories are nearer the top of the cognitive deck. Now, there's been dozens of studies looking at color over the years, but we can ask whether this codability of the senses applies to other domains too. So what happens if we look at shape or sound or touch, taste, smell? Are these equally codable in language? And here there seems to be evidence to suggest that perhaps not. It's been claimed especially that smell is the mute sense, the one without words. And Ackerman has a very nice expressive quote to illustrate this. She says, if there are words for all the pastels in a hue, the lavenders, mauves, fuchsias, plums, and lilacs, who will name the tones and the tints of a smell? It's as if we were hypnotized en masse and told to selectively forget. It may be, too, that smells move us so profoundly in part because we cannot utter their names. In a world sayable and lush, where marvels offer themselves up readily for verbal dissection, smells are often right on the tip of our tongues, but no closer, and it gives them a kind of magical distance, a mystery, a power without a name, a sacredness. So here is quite a strong claim that smells are there moving us unconsciously, but not lendable to verbal expression. And this has been the dominant view for many years, with neuroscientists looking for explanations in terms of our neurobiology to explain the fact that smells don't seem to be verbalizable, and geneticists pointing to a trade-off between color vision and olfactory sensitivity as a possible biological explanation for our cognitive limitations. So is smell really inexpressible? And are all of the senses equally codable in language? To test this, we conducted a large-scale cross-cultural study where we gave participants stimuli for each of the perceptual modalities, colors, textures, smells, and tastes to name. We collected data from 20 languages from around the world. We tried to sample languages to be as diverse as possible and as many different dimensions as possible. And the data was collected in collaboration with a number of researchers who were experts on those languages. So who either had been doing primary linguistic description of those languages or native speakers who conduct research in those languages. So using the stimuli as a basis and a standardized protocol in all of the field sites, we collected data that was brought back, so free naming data for each of the perceptual stimuli, which we then coded according to a standardized framework. So we can look at that data in a number of different ways, but we can ask whether all of those modalities are equally expressible and whether there's a hierarchy of the senses in terms of their codability. So codability here, I'm just going to take to be agreement within a speaker community. So you'll remember Brown and Lenneberg found a correlation among a number of different measures, but we're just going to look at speaker agreement within each community. And I'm going to use Simpson's Diversity Index to measure codability. And Simpson's Diversity Index is a measure from ecology, which captures ecological species diversity within an ecological space, where 0 would mean, in our case, every single speaker gives a completely unique response, and 1 would mean every single speaker gave exactly the same response. So we might not care so much about the exact numbers here. What we care about is the relative codability of the senses within each language community. And if we plot what we find for English, we find that the relative codability of the senses is as you might predict from this hierarchy, that visual phenomena are more codable and that smell is particularly difficult to express in language. But out of the 20 languages that we studied, we find that there are 13 different rank orders in which the senses are coded. So for example, Farsi shows high codability for taste and lowest codability for sound. Umpala shows lowest codability for the visual phenomena and highest codability for smell. So this is just taking the average codability of the senses. We can also look at the full data set for including all of the stimuli. And if we model this, we can also show that the relative codability of the senses is culturally relative. Next, we can ask what accounts for this cross-linguistic variation. Can we predict which senses are going to be high or low codability within a particular linguistic community? And here we might distinguish macro-level cultural factors from micro-level cultural factors. So by this, I mean, for macro-level factors, things like just population size. Languages differ in the number of speakers that they have. They also differ in whether the community has formal schooling and literacy. But we can also look at micro-level factors. So for each of the sensory modalities, They may be specific predictions that we have. So for example, it's been suggested that color naming might be related to color technology, that communities that have more color dyeing technology may have more color names and find it easier to talk about colors. Similarly, there may be a relationship between traditional crafts, or whether there's specific patterns that are applied and the naming of shapes, or the existence of a musical culture and the naming of sounds. So for each of our modalities, we took from the ethnographic literature specific predictions or hypotheses and used an ethnographic questionnaire to collect systematic data for each of our communities and use that to see if we could predict the linguistic data that we find. And indeed, we find some interesting patterns in the data. So just looking at overall codability, how much agreement there is in naming stimuli regardless of the sensory modality, we find, surprising to me at least, that the larger the population, the more codability there is in the community. I'd have thought for large populations, perhaps because there's more dialectal variation or idiolectal variation, that there may be more variation in how sensory stimuli are named, but that seems not to be the case. Instead, it seems in small scale communities, perhaps where there's shared common ground, there's more variation in how people label sensory stimuli. We also found that formal schooling seems to standardize language, so there's more consensus. But for the specific modalities, we do find relationships. So if a community has specialist musicians in that community, then everyone is better at naming sounds. So there's more agreement in how to name sounds. Similarly, formal schooling seems to affect the naming of shapes, but so does having patterned pottery in the community. And if you live in an angular house, there's more agreement in how to name angular shapes than if you live in round houses. And it turns out, if you're a hunter-gatherer, you show more agreement in how to name smells than if you're a non-hunter-gatherer. So we can predict the linguistic coding based on cultural parameters. So the study shows that not all senses are equally expressible in language, that the faculty of language doesn't constrain due to intrinsic cognitive architecture the degree to which the sensory domains are coded in the first place, and that the mapping of language onto the senses is culturally relative. And for me, this emphasizes that we should be studying living human beings within the context of their practical activities if we're really to understand why language is the way that it is. So let's think about our own community, for example. We might think that vision is dominant because of the way that the brain is organized, but we can also think about the cultural practices and activities that hone our visual abilities. Walter Ong has suggested that literacy plays an important role, but we can also see modern technologies really shape our visual attention. And I think it's not surprising then in that context to think about the things that we do in our everyday activities. So we choose fruits and vegetables to be perfect visual objects. And we throw away wonky fruits and veg, even though now there's an attempt to do that. If you go to Thailand or Malaysia, people are choosing what vegetables and fruits to eat based on their smell, not just based on their visual appearance. In the UK, 490 million litres of milk every year are wasted because people are using the use-by dates instead of using their noses to see whether milk is off. And this has got sustainability implications too. So 1 litre of milk can account for up to 4.5 kilograms of CO2. So if we were to use our noses and not just our visual senses in order to orient with our food and drink, it might be quite a different picture. And that raises a question of what happens in other communities where that perhaps doesn't have the same technological orientation that we do. So in small scale farming communities or hunting and gatherer communities, are the senses used in different ways? And there is evidence that it does. So my PhD student, Evelina Vnook, did primary field work with the Manit, who are hunter-gatherer community in Malaysia. And they use bamboos for containers. I'm going to show you a video of a woman in a tropical rainforest in Thailand who is cutting down some bamboo and checking to see whether it would make a good container for her purposes. So you'll see she cuts down this bamboo and then smells it to see if it's a good container or not. So she discards that one because it's bo'o. But in this one, she smells it and she takes it because it's jang'o. So a Manit has a dedicated lexicon for different types of smells. So the bo'o smelling bamboo is a term that's used for the smell of mud, patai beans, wet clothing, but also rotting bamboo, specific tuber species, and so forth. And the one that she selected that smelled jang'o is used for fragrant sorts of things like wild yams, cooked meat, hog badger, and so forth. And it's different from Khmer sorts of smells, which are for various millipedes and specific poisonous plants and flying fox and so forth. So these lexical categories are picking out different qualities of smells, and it's important to point out that they're not picking out objects, despite what this attempted translation seems to suggest. And maybe as a way of just illustrating this, if you can just try and think or imagine the smell of raw or unripe banana versus ripe banana versus overripe banana. If you can conjure those, you know that those smells are quite different. Or consider raw garlic versus gently fried garlic versus burnt garlic. All these are garlic, but they have different smell qualities. In the same way that these translations might suggest a relationship between an object, it's not the object that's been categorized, it's the smell quality at a specific time. So for example, the hog badger in Manit smells jang'o, but it only smells jang'o during the dry season. In the wet season, it smells hai, or it smells like a monitor lizard. It's an unpleasant smell. And for the Manit, when the hog badger smells jang'o, then they'll go to the area where the hog badgers are and set up camp so that they can hunt it. That's where it's the best time to hunt that particular badger. So again, I just want to emphasize it's the smell quality that matters, not the smell object. Now, Manit is one of a number of indigenous languages in the Malay Peninsula. It's one of a number of Aslian languages that has smell vocabulary. And it turns out there's, in the languages that we've studied to date, most of them seem to show quite sophisticated smell lexicons, sizable smell lexicons. And in fact, they cross-cut. It might seem as if being a hunter-gatherer is the most critical thing, but it seems to cross-cut that. So we see that the northern Aslian languages are typically spoken by mobile foragers, and the central ones by slash and burn agriculturalists, and the southern ones by trader-collectors. And in all three subgroups, we find smell lexicons. So it doesn't necessarily go along with being a hunter-gatherer for there to be lexical elaboration in smell. And in fact, if we go outside of the Malay Peninsula, we see sizable smell lexicons in most parts of the world. And based on corpus studies, we can show that there's many languages where talk about smell is more frequent than we find in English. And experimental studies show that smell is more codable than in English in many communities as well. So it raises the question of what's happening here. Now you'll notice there's a large gap here in Eurasia where we don't seem to find languages with smell lexicons. And it's a bit unclear whether this is genuinely the case or whether it's just a gap in our current documentation. So we'll need to do the empirical studies to find out. But it has been suggested that perhaps English doesn't have a smell lexicon right now because we're in a technological age, but perhaps we did in the past. And in fact, cultural anthropologists have suggested that the lack of interest in smell is relatively recent, that it may have come about during the Industrial Revolution. In fact, it may have been particularly exacerbated around the First World War in the modern era where people moved away from villages and farms and started living in cities, that at that time there was a movement away from our sense of smell. Now, if that's the case, we should see evidence of this if we look in the corpus. But in fact, we don't. If we look at the use of smell language as all sensory language in English from the 1800s to 2000, the lack of smell talk seems to be pretty stable for the last 200 years. So it seems whatever the cause might be for English lacking a smell lexicon, it's been something that's been in place for quite some time. So it's an open question right now what cultural or environmental factors might give rise to these cross-linguistic differences. There's a few things that we might speculate might be important. So we saw for the Manit that material culture could be important for using our sense of smell, perhaps hunting, perhaps the use of smell in medicine, in ritual, in religion, in beliefs about the natural and supernatural, in child rearing even. So these are potential cultural activities that might be important for whether smell lexicons develop or not. But all in all, it suggests that there are differences in nameable categories, but the cross-linguistic studies alone don't tell us what's nearer the top of the cognitive deck. To be able to address that aspect of it, we need another type of evidence. So I want to move on to experimental studies with two different domains now, with smell and with sound, that illustrate beyond color, we find differences in sensory experiences in line with the language encoding across cultures. So first, smell. In particular, we wondered whether different ways of talking about smell might change the nature of the odor concept. And one place that might happen is in how smells are related to the other senses. So it's been shown that people associate smells with color. So the smell of banana, for example, with the color yellow. And that could be because there's a direct connection, sensory connection between the experience of smell and the experience of color. On the other hand, it could also be the case that people experience a smell, label it banana mentally, and then think, what color are bananas? And then choose yellow as an associate for that smell. So there's an indirect connection mediated versus via verbal labeling. Now, if that's the case, then for speakers of Manit that describe the same smell in a different way, the association to colors would be different. So because the Manit smell words aren't associated with a specific object, then it's not clear that there should be any particular color that smell would be associated with. So we can pit against a direct perceptual account, which would suggest that all communities would have the same, that experience bananas at least, would have the same association between the smell of banana and the color, versus a linguistically mediated account where we would predict there should be differences cross-culturally. So to test this, we looked at the Manit, who you've already been introduced to, who live in Thailand, and we compared them to Dutch participants who, like English, describe smells according to their sources. We had a third group as well, the Thai. So Thai, like Manit, does have a smell lexicon, but like the Dutch, live in a modern urban community. So we can try and tease apart broad-based cultural factors from specific linguistic factors and how smells and colors might be associated. So what we did was we took a number of odors, real odor objects that exist in Thailand or in the Netherlands or are common to both countries, and gave participants these smells one at a time and asked them to choose the color that best matched the smell that they were given. And we did this over 2 testing periods. So we can look to see what colors people match with what odors. But we can also look at whether the way that they describe smells tested later on might predict their odor color associations. And in fact, what we find when you look at the data is that for those speakers, regardless of which community they're in, For those speakers that describe an odor with a source-based descriptions, they have a more consistent and correct color association. Whereas for those speakers that have an abstract smell term, there's no consistent smell color association. And that makes sense if you think that these smell words are abstractions. So as Nietzsche pointed out, something like the word leaf is abstracting over every single exemplar of leaves. So it's not capturing a particular leaf shape. In the same way, we can say for speakers of a language with a smell lexicon, where the smell term isn't specific to an object, there's an abstraction over that smell quality that isn't necessarily associated with a specific visual percept as well. We find converging evidence that language might play a role in our perceptual experiences of smell from wine experts. So in separate studies, we've shown that wine experts have a more specialized vocabulary and that there's more agreement on how to talk about wine smells and tastes. Then wine experts have more agreement than non-experts, both coffee experts and lay people. And if we look at corpus, we can also see the kinds of strategies that they use. And there seems to be dedicated strategies that wine experts consensually use to pick out different qualities of wine. So we can ask whether this affects our non-linguistic cognition too. And in one study, we looked at whether wine experts also differ in their imagery for wine. So we developed a questionnaire where we asked speakers, wine experts, imagine you were going to a short wine tasting where you will try different wines. Let's say the tasting starts with a French white wine, a Sauvignon Blanc. Now we want you to imagine the color of the wine as the sun is reflected in your glass. You indicate how vividly you can imagine the color of that wine on a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 is extremely vivid. I can ask you to imagine the smell of the wine as you place your nose in the glass, and the taste of the wine when you have your first sip. So if you ask people to rate the vividness of their imagery for the color, smell, and taste of wine, and if you do this with novices that regularly drink wine but don't have knowledge about them, then what you find is that people report more strong imagery for the visual aspect of wines than the smell or taste. But if we look at experts, then we see that there's no statistical difference between their smell and taste imagery and their visual imagery. So their smell and taste imagery for wines is enhanced compared to novices. And we can see that it's specific for wines. So if we compare wine experts to novices for their imagery for wine smells, experts show an enhanced effect, but that doesn't generalize to common smells. So wine experts are no different in their imagery for the smell, imagining the smell of banana or rose or coffee. Now, this study doesn't tell us whether the wine experts have learned to have better smell imagery or whether perhaps they already had really good smell and taste imagery and that's what led them to become wine experts in the first place. So to be able to tease this apart, we tried to, well, in fact, we did recruit participants who'd signed up for a one-year course at the Wine Academy in Amsterdam. So we were able to test people at the beginning of their course and at the end of their course, and then compare their imagery for the multimodal experience of wine at the beginning and end in comparison to a novice group that we tested at the same 2 time points. And what we find is that, in fact, the training that they get through the wine course improves their multisensory imagery for wines, whereas novices don't show any difference over the 2 time points. So overall, wine experts show enhanced sensory imagery for wines, specifically for wines, and that seems to be a result of training. So that's evidence from smell that language may bolster our cognition for smells. I want to move now to sounds. So in a earlier work, which looked at different metaphors for sounds used for describing auditory pitch. So in English, we describe auditory pitch in terms of a vertical metaphor, high, low. And it's been suggested that this may have an evolutionary basis, that high sounds do indeed come from higher in space than low sounds, and that our ears, the anatomy of our ears, has been evolutionarily adapted to pick up exactly this pitch difference. Interestingly, we find across languages that the high-low metaphor isn't the most prevalent for talking about auditory pitch. And another prevalent metaphor for talking about auditory pitch is thin and thick instead. So in a study from almost 10 years ago now, we compared Dutch participants and Farsi participants in their non-linguistic experience of sounds. And we wondered whether the Dutch, who have a high-low metaphor like English, and Farsi, who have a thin-thick metaphor for pitch, might differ in their non-linguistic experiences. So the task that we used was quite simple. We played participants a single note and asked them to sing it back. And we played those notes in the face of different spatial stimuli. So in one condition, participants saw lines at different heights. In another condition, they saw lines of different thicknesses. And we crossed the heights and the pitches. So the spatial stimuli and the auditory stimuli had no connection to one another. But what we're interested in is whether the irrelevant spatial stimulus, be it height or thickness, affects how people sing back the auditory stimulus that they've heard. And in fact, it does. So if we look at the Dutch participants in the height condition, we can see that Dutch participants sing back the same note higher when they see a line higher on the screen, whereas for Farsi speakers, that doesn't make any difference. Whereas for Farsi speakers, they sing back the same note lower, the thicker the line, whereas for Dutch participants, that doesn't make any difference. So the reproduction of the sound is influenced by the irrelevant spatial stimulus. And in other studies, we're able to show that this effect is still there, even when you use verbal interference. So unlike color, it seems that language isn't just being used online here, but that language might have played a formative role in creating these cross-linguistic mappings. But we can also show with language training, we can teach the Dutch participants to be Farsi-like. So if you train them on the thickness linguistic metaphor and the non-linguistic sing-back task, they also show an effective thickness. So here it seems that language can play a formative role in creating these cross-modal mappings. And once those mappings are established, they seem to be available even without the use of language online. In a more recent study, we used a slightly different paradigm, which involved a communication task. So here we had two sets of two participants within any one paradigm. So one participant's the describer and the other one's the matcher. Both of them hear a series of notes in a melody, and the describer has to describe what they've heard without singing back the notes, so using a verbal description. And the matcher has to say whether they heard the same set of notes or whether they heard something different. And so we can look at a number of different things, including the verbal descriptions, the gestural descriptions, and then the comprehension on the part of the matcher. So using both verbal and gestural data, we can show that Dutch speakers are consistently using high-low metaphors, verbal metaphors, but the Farsi speakers don't. So they consistently map high-low metaphors to high-low pitch, but the Farsi speakers occasionally in this experiment actually use high-low vocabulary, but when they do, they don't use it in a consistent way. More importantly, even in their gesture, we see cross-linguistic differences. The Dutch speakers map gesture space to pitch height robustly, but the Farsi speakers don't seem to do so in the same way. So that shows, again, cross-linguistic differences, and we see that impacting comprehension. So the Farsi speakers show lower matching ability from the descriptions that they get from their partners. So altogether, what this suggests to me, at least, is that cross-cultural differences in the coding of the senses in turn affect our perceptual experiences. And that Brown and Lenneberg really were right when they said that language is a mold for thought. So, all in all, I think it's important when we're thinking about the evolution of language to think about the role that language might play at different stages of the acquisition process or the formation. So what's there in the language-ready brain, but also how does cognition change on learning a specific tongue? So if we're thinking about the evolution of language, it's of course interesting to think about how humans differ from non-human primates, for example, but it's as important to think about how humans differ from one another and what that cross-linguistic variation might tell us about the nature of cognition. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Asifa.
I hope the sound was okay for the rest of it. Was it?
I think in our room we had a little bit of trouble, but we solved it. I think for everyone else it was fine.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll be happy to take questions both from our panelists and from the audience. If you are an audience member and you have a question, please use the Q&A and have a look at the Q&A and upvote questions you'd like to hear the answers to. But we're going to first have some discussion amongst the panelists. So I open it to you folks. Ev.
Hey, that was a great talk. Thanks, Asifa. I have a question. I'm trying to wrap my head around this language as a mold metaphor. And it weirdly presupposes some kind of primacy of language, whereas I totally get the effects of culture on how we perceive the world. Of course it should, right? We have very different perceptual experiences. And then it also seems to naturally follow that it will be reflected in the linguistic properties, right? If our culture places demands on us, for example, to think about, smells a lot or something else is important, we'll come up with a vocabulary to capture that, just like we do in expertise, different kinds of expertise within a language. But it seems, I'm not sure I'm quite getting this metaphor. Like how is this a mold as opposed to just like a consequence of differential experiences being reflected in language?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few different ways to think about this. So for me, it's one of the ways that culture has an effect is through language. And I don't really care, honestly, whether it's specifically language that's doing the job or not. But I do think there are ways to figure out whether language is specifically having an effect. And then in the kind of naturalistic field studies that you do, often language and culture are coming as a package. So you're right. So within a specific cultural context or environmental context, you'll develop language games that enable you to deal with that specific situation. But there are cases where the two starts to diverge, and that's because language can change to rapidly in the face of new environmental or cultural consequences. So the language lags behind a little bit to what's happening in cultural exchange. So for example, think about just technologies coming in where the indigenous language is still in place, but the day-to-day activities have now changed. So you can look at those sorts of situations. You also find situations like, so for us, it was really exciting to find a place where we found two communities, a hunter-gatherer and a non-hunter-gatherer community that both had smell lexicons. but where we could ask whether the codability of the senses is coming about because of subsistence or because of the a specific language that they have there, for example. So there can be natural cases where you can tease those things apart. But it's not the same as looking at it experimentally. So that's why I think in terms of the lab, then the training studies become more important to see what role language is playing in actually making those categories themselves. So I think there are naturalistic cases where you might be able to tease apart the specific role of language and culture. And I think there are lab experiments where you might be able to look to see specifically what language is doing in terms of the cognitive categories that are being created. It's a long-winded way to address some of what you might be hinting at.
Go ahead, Tecumseh.
Thanks, Asifa. That was very interesting. And I particularly like your wine stuff because my cousin is a sommelier. And so I've been kind of thrown into the deep end of this whole wine terminology world. And I wanted to, I'm interested in this idea of Dan Slobin's that of thinking for speaking, so that our sensory experience is encoded in language insofar as we're going to talk about it, which I think is almost indubitable. And then the question is, what if you're not going to talk about it? And so my first question was just whether, so you talked about the difference in smell vocabulary in, say, English and Manic. But of course, English has a huge smell vocabulary. It's just that it's tied to, we think of it as tastes. So we talk about strawberry or banana, but actually our taste buds aren't doing anything. It's all done by our olfactory system. So from a biological point of view, those are our smell words. But my bigger question was whether you've done what I'm really interested in is not the degree to which people can talk about these smells or do habitually talk about them, as much as does it affect their actual ability to perceive. And as far as I saw, you didn't actually get at that. So you got at the words they have and how much they use those words, but you didn't say that actually the Manic are better at smelling than, say, whatever, that an average human, an average English speaker, whatever that is, a chef and a sommelier might be very different.
Yeah. Let's look at the vocabulary first. So I'm relying on the notion of basic perceptual vocabulary coming from Berlin and Kay. So, and I think it's important here to distinguish conveyability versus codability. So English speakers may be able to convey a specific smell by using ad hoc descriptions. So source nouns, for example, so I can say it smells like banana or strawberry or coffee or something like that. So these are ad hoc descriptions. You're just using your noun lexicon for anything that can potentially emit a smell to describe a specific percept, as opposed to having a dedicated lexicon that picks out a specific quality. So the analogy to color, I think, here is useful. So we can say English has a basic color lexicon, red, green, blue. These are picking out color qualities that aren't specific objects. So we could use specific sources. We could say moss colored or sky colored or something like that, but that's not what English speakers primarily do when they're describing colors. They use one of these basic colors. So there's a secondary lexicon too, like mauve and lilac and so forth. But in terms of if you look at just frequency, or if you look at what happens in an elicitation task, then people will use their basic vocabulary. So English doesn't have a basic smell vocabulary. The closest is probably fragrant, stinky, but these are not really smell terms in the same sense. So if I say the cheese is fragrant and you say the cheese is stinky, both of those things can be true of the same cheese because they seem to be something about our subjective experience of that cheese. Whereas if I say it's white and you say it's green, there seems to be a matter of fact that there's something wrong here in this situation. We have to figure out what the matter of fact is. So fragrant and stinky seem to be slightly different. So the closest, I think, in English to a basic smell term is musty. So musty does pick out a smell quality. It's a specific quality. It's not specific to an object though. And so languages like Mani have 15 terms in Mani that are different smell qualities. They're not associated with a specific source. It's a coherent lexicon. So speakers know all of these terms, they'll list them, they apply them to smell. We can show that they're not related to any noun in the lexicon. So they're basic, they're picking out abstract smell qualities, and they're qualitatively different to what English speakers are doing. So there's quite different. So I would separate out what's coded in the language versus what's conveyable in the language. And that does have consequences just for things like frequency and how easily speakers are able to identify or name those percepts. So for the smell lexicons, whether that affects perception is a bit of a tricky case. So for color, we know what the psychophysical space for color is. For smell, we don't have a good theory yet. I mean, there's people that are doing incredible work in this area, and so it gets better all the time. But just to figure out how to sample olfactory space so that we can ask the same sorts of questions is a bit trickier. So you can just take, some odors and just look at detection thresholds or discrimination thresholds. But if we again take the analogy to color, it's not where the effects have been coming about is in categorical perception. So where you have boundaries between two colors. And if we're looking, we need a bit more information about the olfactory space before we can design studies that are targeted to the lexical coding of smell. So it's something that we're certainly thinking about and working towards, but we haven't got there quite yet.
Can I just follow up? So all these words that the wine guys use, like minerality, coumarin, cilantro, you would call all of those conveyability terms because
no,
they're always referring to something out of some kind of noun.
No, I would distinguish. So again, I would distinguish everyday vocabulary from expert genres. So expert genres are quite different. So if you are, let's say you make lipsticks, or you work in the color industry, or you're a paint maker, you're going to have all sorts of terms. And part of what those terms are doing is picking out specific shades. But also what you're doing when you come up with lexical terms there is indicating something about your expertise in making those distinctions. And I think that's partly what's happening in the wine genre. So if you look at what people are doing, and part of what they're doing is using source descriptions of various kinds. So Chardonnay's like got a grassy note or whatever in terms of the notes that it has. But there's also a lot of use of metaphor. So the wine has legs, it has body, it has, so there's human body and race car metaphors and so forth. So there's these metaphorical uses. And what we can show is that wine experts, there is some conventionalization there. You can see that in agreement, but also you can distinguish specific, say, authors of wine reviews because they're using different vocabulary. So they're trying to distinguish themselves from others by showing a special, how eloquent they are in using that vocabulary. So I think the linguistic games that happen in expert genres is quite different to what happens in everyday vocabulary. And I think the cognitive consequences might also be different just because of the type of cognition that is required in each case.
Thanks.
So thanks, Asifa. That was super interesting. And I think it was also a really nice illustration of something that came up in the question period after my talk, which is none of the models that I talked about had utility in them, right? Like what it is that you're using language for, and your results show how important that is in terms of shaping the language. I'm curious if you think that there are any formal frameworks that are consistent with the kinds of results that you see. The closest I can think of is maybe some of the work by Terry Regier and Charles Kemp and Noga Zaslavsky. But I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there should be a way to have some coming together there, but I'm not quite sure what that looks like yet, actually. How, I don't know if it's a lack of imagination on my part or lack of data. So, I mean, one simple way might just be So one thing that Terry and colleagues have been doing is using, let's say, corpus data from English to estimate utility, kind of assuming that the frequencies might reveal something universal about what's relevant. And so we could start looking at corpora from different languages to see what might be most important. But I kind of don't like that so much because it's using language internal evidence to look at what's happening in the language system. So ideally, you'd want some way to operationalize some of the cultural activities, I think, to see how they might fit in. So either cultural or environmental differences that we see between communities to see how they fit. So I think that would be a super exciting way to go. But for myself, I'm not quite sure what exactly that looks like. I'd love to hear what you think, if there's a way to bring them together.
Yeah, I think there is, and I suspect some of the people in the audience in the room there have ideas about how to do that too, and maybe ways to look at that experimentally, which I think would be interesting to manipulate some of those things. Yeah.
Thanks. Any other comments from the panelists? If not, I will look for questions from the room. Yes, you can come on up here. Sorry, I don't know your name, but you're welcome to come on up and ask a question.
They might not be able to
They
hear.
might not hear you, so it's better if you can come up. Thank you.
Hi. Super quick, small question on the very first cultural parameters slide with the box plots, where you said about you were surprised that the languages with the large number of speakers had didn't have greater variation, but actually it would seem as if a language with a large number of speakers, or one thing you didn't mention is size of network, like connectivity among the speakers. So if it's a urban society with a chopped up words are smaller, syllables are shorter, there's more books and packaging of tags and syllables, and you connect with a larger number of people, then the language has to be standardized. Whereas a hunter-gatherer society where you're only talking to your extended family, it's an agglutinative language and your words are longer and can be more personal and idiomatic. And so do you have anything to say about network and connectivity?
So it's not the case, at least in our language sample, that small scale languages are all, say, agglutinating and large scale languages are isolating or something like that. That's not the case in our sample. But in terms of the network, and maybe another corrective, just that for hunter-gatherer communities, they differ quite a lot in their residence pattern, so they're not all alike. So, for example, the Mani are a fission-fusion group, so they are small camps, but then people kind of go off and join another camp. And there is some multilingualism as well within the communities there. But other hunter-gatherer communities are more settled and can live in larger groups. So I think there are some wrinkles in there. But in terms of your overarching question about what the relationship might be to social network, I think that's a really interesting question and not something that we can address in our study right now. So we don't have that data for the participants in our study. So I can't tell you whether underlyingly there could be something about the social networks that's leading to those differences in codability. The best predictor that we have is just the population size itself. So I think that is an interesting question, maybe something for somebody else to look at downstream.
Thanks.
Hi, Asifa. Great talk. Thanks so much. I have a question, but I also now have a comment following up to that interesting question we just had. So there is some evidence that goes along the same lines here of having smaller communities having more variability if you compare so-called village sign languages and deaf community sign languages. So there seems to be a higher variability in the sign language emergence cases where there's a small population. And Lemore, Aviv, Bill Thompson and I have a model which we still haven't written up yet, where we show that same effect, so that small populations kind of counterintuitively can support more variability if you assume that speakers are able to keep track of who they've been learning from. So if speakers can learn a model of other speakers as well as a kind of a higher order model of the population, then you can keep track of more variability in a small population. So I think that matches your data really nicely. So that was the comment. But the question I had was actually it's about hedonic valence. And so this is just completely naive, but is it true that smell terms are more likely to line up along some kind of spectrum of pleasantness or hedonic valence? And do you think that makes a difference? Because it seems to me that some of the results you see in like cross-modal work might be using some kind of hedonic valence as a mediating factor between modalities.
Yeah, so maybe your comment first. So that fits actually our data as well. So one of the communities that we looked at was Katakalok, which is a village sign. It's one of the small ones that showed a lot of variability. And I think, so Steve Levinson is one of the authors of the paper, he was like, I'm not surprised that there's variation because in small scale communities, you've got shared context. You can rely on pragmatics and inference to get shared meanings. You don't need to have it linguistically encoded. So he suggests that perhaps one of the things that happens with large languages is that you can't rely on pragmatics in the same way. Now you start having to like put more into the encoding of words, and that's why you get the codability. So it wasn't surprising to him, it was surprising to me. In terms of the olfactory vocabularies, Bodo Winter has modeled English smell and taste lexicons and shown that they are indeed more effectively loaded than other sensory terms. And in my own work, it's clear that pleasantness is a major axis, and that languages tend to make more distinctions in different types of unpleasant odors than different types of pleasant odors. So there's more differentiation there. And it's differentiation by quality. So not just, they're really distinct different ways to be unpleasant. I think that's relevant. And indeed, the olfactory sense itself seems to be primarily oriented towards pleasantness as well. So people seems to be some universality, at least, in the types of odors that people perceive to be pleasant and unpleasant. So in a recent study we did, we found that there was a shared orientation to which odors are pleasant and unpleasant. So I think that's certainly there. But I still think that there's something sort of fundamentally different, and maybe this anecdote kind of illustrates it, even if we don't have the experimental data quite to back it up yet. So there was a study of there was a newspaper article a while back where a neighbor had died and her body was rotting for quite some days, and the body was emitting quite a putrid odor. There's this distinct odor of rotting bodies. The neighbor had smelt something bad, but they just thought it was like a bathroom. So they thought there's something wrong with the toilet, and those are very distinct qualities. But for him, they were both just stinks. So I think that shows you, I think in a way that illustrates that if you just are lumping everything together just as different, they're all just stinks, you're not making those noticing those sorts of distinctions, you're less likely to notice them. So I think that's a kind of interesting space to look into, where you've got qualitatively distinct things. I think you're more likely to notice that there's a different type of thing going on and maybe pay more attention in that kind of context. So it's a bit of a gruesome anecdote, but yeah, I think that over and beyond just the pleasantness and unpleasantness, I think having the categorical distinctions that you see in languages makes a difference to how people are cognizing about those odors.
Okay, can I follow up a little?
Okay, a little.
Okay, yeah, so I'm wondering if there is, if a particular sense has a tendency to have shared perceptions of positive or negative affect, then maybe there's less need for language to carve that up. So color, we don't agree on what's a nice color and a not nice color. So we need to go into more detail in distinguishing them. Does that have any legs, that idea?
Well, I think in the color literature, there have been some speculations that there's universally pleasant, there's a shared aesthetic preferences for colors as well. So maybe it's, I'm not sure whether color is really more variable in terms of the aesthetics than olfaction is. Yeah.
Can I also ask a quick follow-up question? So I was wondering a bit about, and maybe you mentioned this, but like the degree of frequency with which people experience different smells. What a cutie. So for example, if people have never smelled a dead body, that seems to be something different from people not being able to kind of perceive the difference between them. And I guess it's relatively easy for me to imagine that there are cultural differences in our experiences of different smells.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also a great question in terms of whether there might be more similarities in our visual experiences and our olfactory experiences. So for sure, if you live in a temperate environment like we do versus a tropical environment, then the olfactory profiles are quite different. I did think that I noticed on that map that you showed of where the smell lexicons are, they seem to be kind of in a particular geographic band. Yeah, but that's where there's the most linguistic diversity, right? So and that's where linguistic descriptions happen. So in fact, there are 3 communities of Siberian hunter-gatherers that seem to have smell terms. So there hasn't been a systematic description, but there's even a grammaticalized smell suffix in one of them that's been documented. So I suspect that if somebody were to do the full documentation, you would find them there too. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I think the question we should be asking is, why don't we have it? Like, really, rather than why other people do. I mean, smell is important. Like, you should be paying attention to it. I mean, so when you think like, okay, you think, well, visual information is always more important. But let's say now I give you a delicious chocolate cake. It is like beautiful. You can see the chocolate just gleaming. But now, if that was smelling of shit, no matter how visually pleasing it was, you would not put it in your mouth, right? The olfactory information is going to override your visual information in that context. So that's
an empirical question.
Unless you recently had COVID, then you might.
So I mean, so I think like it's not like we ignore olfactory information. I think the question is, why are we not relying on it more? I mean, I think that's a puzzle for me. I still can't quite figure out what's going on there. So I think part of it, I think maybe the cultural anthropologists are onto something. The fact that, we develop now electronic noses to put into our fridges to tell us when milk is off. So we don't trust our own noses. We know that historically, for example, roses were grown for their sense, and then they started to being bred for the double petal and their colours at the expense of their olfactory sense. So there's various things that have happened in our culture that all kind of move away. So we're creating our environment to be less scented. I don't know what's going on there. So I think for me that's more the puzzle than, well, that's all a puzzle really. Why do we ever find out?
Do we have other questions from this audience here? Yes, come on up.
So I'm thinking about this sort of in relation to the last thing you said, and it's kind of a small question, but I noticed as well on the map that you showed, not only is like Eurasia completely empty, but also North America north of Mexico is also completely empty. I wondered if, which also means like sort of the whole like north of the planet is empty. I wondered if there was like empirical work on those indigenous American languages, or if that's a lack of that is why that area is empty.
So the map is, I wish I could say we'd systematically looked at a diverse sample of languages, and that's what we found. Instead, it's based on what languages have been documented to have smell lexicons. So so first of all, people thought nothing existed. Then there was a few case studies, and then what happens when those case studies appear is that people that are working on related languages in that area start looking to see if those languages have them too. So that's why you end up with these clusters. So for the gaps, I really just don't know whether they're genuine gaps or whether they're just overlooked languages. And without the systematic studies, we just don't know. So I feel like I don't want to over-interpret the distribution of those languages, given the way that the languages have been sampled so far, are being described so far.
Makes great sense. Thanks.
Yeah, come on up.
Hey, it's maybe just a very small comment with what you just said a bit earlier. I think our sort of just biological setups or perception for colors and smells are just different. I can see the difference between black and white. I can see them, I can recognize them today or tomorrow. If I stay in a room with black and white, I can still recognize them in half an hour. But that's not necessarily the case for smells, right? Like if you give me two smells, like the boundary between smells are not as clear as colors. So if I go into smelly room, I stay there for half an hour, I will just ignore that smell, like my nose, the depth of smell. I just can't just keep paying attention to different smells in my environment. So it feels like our natural perception for smells and colors are different. So it makes sense that our language and the way we think about them are different. I think it's definitely a reason why the language, vocabulary, how they are different, because maybe we just feel them differently.
Yeah, I mean that's a great prediction, and one that we started with, that the different senses may have different affordances that make them differentially available for language. But the cross-cultural data is showing that it can't just be that's going on, because although smell is not so codable in English, it is in the other languages. And even though visual phenomena are, so colors and shapes, these primary things are available for all of the communities that we studied. In some communities, they show low codability. So it's not just that you can read off what's going to be expressed in language from the affordances of each of the perceptual modalities themselves. The differences seem to be coming, in my view, from differences in the cultural packaging of those different senses. So that's what leads to the different expressibility.
I actually really like the way when you show the video about the bamboo example, because actually you input some utility why that recognizing that smell make a difference, right? Because actually you need that smell to decide whether the bamboo can be used for for the thing or not, because it seems like they do have like higher utility, which is not something in a different culture usually have. I definitely agree with the culture packages thing, but I feel like there's also like biological structures back there to provide that go together with all the culture.
Yeah, I mean, I don't deny that it's going to be useful, but also there are visual cues to the bamboo for whether it's rotten or not. So she could have just used her visual, the visual information to decide, but she uses the olfactory information too. I think it's kind of interesting. So I was just having a conversation about this earlier with somebody. So I think in our culture, we're so used to having vision as giving us the most veridical information about the world. So it's the most trustworthy sense. But if you look at historical records, that wasn't always the truth. If you look at religious texts, for example, you find these things where, there's a beggar lying on the street, but he smells of roses, and that's how we know he's actually a saint. Or there's this dapper gentleman that appears, but he smells of sulfur, and that's how we know he's the devil. So in those kinds of lores, what we see is that the visual signal is easy to fake, and the olfactory signal isn't. And that's telling us something true about the person or the entity. So that is something that's kind of like latently there in our culture too, but maybe not so foregrounded at the moment.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll take a couple of questions from the Q&A. These are, I think, related to things we've already been talking about, but in any case. Okay, so we've got one from Vera Kempa. She says, very inspiring talk. Related to Simon's point about affective valence, we seem to habituate to smells in a way we don't to color. Might that fleeting nature of smells make codability a priori more difficult? So that's closely related to, I think, the question we just had, more closely than I thought. So do you have anything else you want to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is, I think those are the right kinds of questions to ask and things that I've been thinking about as well. So if it's something about the dynamic and temporal aspect of it, then we should predict that smell should pattern like sound, which shares those characteristics. But sound is something that we expect to be highly codable. So if you look at the literature and other studies and so forth, so perhaps there's something about the stability and the constancy or apparent constancy of vision contrasting with something like the temporal or fleeting nature of smells and sounds that makes a difference, perhaps. But again, I would emphasize the cross-cultural variability in the coding that suggests that there's something else that's going on other than just the characteristics of the senses themselves.
There's also a question from Connor Rodenbeck regarding functionality. So it's a long question. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I think they're basically asking whether whether a language has a smell lexicon or not. Is this based on whether we use smells functionally or not? So do we have a sense, I guess, whether in societies where we use these things functionally, is there a kind of causal relationship between that and the smell lexicon?
Excellent question. And I don't think we have the empirical data that we'd need to be able to answer that. So I can point to communities that do have, like at least some of the communities that I've done more close work with, the hunter-gatherer communities, where I can show there's various cultural practices where smell is important and that there's lexical encoding. But I don't know that those cultural practices do not exist in other communities that don't have smell lexicon. So I think it would be awesome to look at this systematically to see if we could empirically confirm whether there is indeed a relationship between the two. Right now, I think it's speculation and too easy to conclude the relationship without all of the relevant data.
Okay, and one more question from the Q&A. Thanks for the great talk. Regarding the wine experts for taste and smell, the data you've collected is self-reported, right? I wonder if there's a way to prove it in the lab.
Yeah, there are other, I mean, there's been some really nice fMRI studies with wine experts and looking at their imagery. I think, and there's some nice kind of interference paradigms that have been used with imagery. So we've kind of been thinking about some of those to see if we can narrow down. So, I mean, it did play a bit fast and loose in the sense that we've looked at how experience might affect imagery, but not specifically whether it's perceptual or linguistic experience that's relevant. So it'd be great to be able to kind of just focus in on that a bit more closely to see what's really at play.
Okay. Oh, one more from Tecumseh, and then we'll call it.
I just don't want to leave this conversation hanging like this, because I'm just going to go away frustrated, because I really feel that you're making a distinction, a terminological distinction between codability and conveyability, which, okay, that's fine. But then this whole conversation has been talking about English doesn't have a lexicon for smell. And to me, that's just not true. Okay, we don't maybe have specific words in the same way that some other languages do, but we're perfectly able to talk about smells and distinguish putrid and rank and funky and earthy and all these other things we've been talking about.
But Tecumseh, we're not. So if I do an experiment with you, with all of you right now, and in fact, there's dozens of studies that have done this, if I give you odors and I ask you to name them, then people are not able to correctly identify the smell, and they give all sorts of different labels. So it would be great if we could come up with a way to convey the thing that was communicatively useful, but we don't seem to be able to do that either.
But isn't that precisely what your wine experts have learned to do? Or I would imagine chefs or farmers or various other people. So
yeah.
If your community needs it, you develop the vocabulary, you standardize.
Yeah, so the wine experts are a little bit better than novices and coffee experts in describing the thing that they've specifically trained on. So there is an advantage, but it's small. And so if you compare, with common odors, if you test an English speaker, they're not able to identify, name common odors around half the time. So, and sometimes in some studies, it's around 30% of the time. So even smells like banana and coffee, like highly familiar, high frequent odors, English speakers aren't able to name them with the resources that they have. So I'm not only relying on the lexical distinctions, the linguistic distinctions in terms of what the lexicon is, but also how people are able to use them in experiments, and also looking at frequency information in corpora. They all seem to triangulate that there's something very different happening between English speakers and speakers of these other languages.
Okay.
Well,
so
I could keep going, but I won't. So.
I felt like that thread was cut. Okay, in any case, thank you so much for the talk and for answering all the questions. Thanks everybody, including people not in the room, for the stimulating discussion. And this closes the Edinburgh Lectures on Language Evolution for this year. So thank you all again for participating. Thanks to all the audiences.
Let me just say thank you to the organizers for a wonderful series. Thank you for hosting.
And hopefully we'll see you back for our lectures next year. So listen out to see who we've got lined up.